handprint. That's often the first thing you see when the torchlight hits the walls. 30,000 years ago, someone pressed their palm against stone and blew ochre across it. A negative imprint, fragile but defiant. I was here. But look past the handprints and the animals, past the bison, the horses, the mammoths that seem to run across the walls, and something stranger emerges. When Paleolithic people finally drew themselves, it wasn't as hunters, or families, or proud portraits. It was as bodies. At Pech-Merle, a human sprawled and pierced with spears. At Lascaux, a man with the head of a bird, lying lifeless before a gutted bison. At Cougnac, figures riddled with projectiles until they collapse. In Taboo and Trois Frères, hybrids that twist between human and beast, neither one nor the other. At Cosquer, a dying figure with a seal-like head drowning in the dark. Why? Why did people who could draw animals in stunning lifelike detail almost never choose to draw themselves? And why, in the rare moments when they did, were they reduced to victims, monsters, or ghosts? For decades, archaeologists have argued maybe they lacked the skill, maybe it was taboo, maybe it was all shamanic visions, but none of those answers really explain the silence or the violence. So today, we're going to follow the handprints into the dark. To ask what these rare, unsettling human depictions were really saying about life 30,000 years ago, and why, after all this time, they still make us uneasy.
If you want to understand why humans are so rarely pictured in Ice Age caves, you have to begin long before Lascaux or Chauvet. On the southern tip of Africa, in Blombos Cave, archaeologists found a piece of ochre small enough to fit in your palm. At first glance, it looked like nothing, but under a microscope, the scratches revealed a deliberate cross-hatched design. When Christopher Henshelwood and his team published the find in Science in 2002, they called it the world's oldest drawing, almost 100,000 years old. Alongside it were perforated shell beads and abalone shells filled with ochre, the first known palettes and ornaments, clear evidence of symbolic thought. And yet, even here, the symbols weren't us. Not a body, not a face, just lines. And it's not just us, Homo sapiens. Tens of thousands of years later, a different species picked up the torch. In Spain, at La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardeles, archaeologists sampled red pigments, dots, ladder shapes, and a sprayed hand stencil. Uranium-thorium dating, published in Science in 2018 by Dirk Hoffman and colleagues, pushed them back to at least 64,000 years ago. That was more than 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, which means it was made by Neanderthals. So the first cave painters of Europe weren't us. It went against the theory that Neanderthals were incapable of producing such art. They too marked walls with signs and hands, but strikingly, not with images of themselves as well. By the time Homo sapiens reached Southeast Asia, the pattern held. On the island of Sulawesi, hand stencils and a pig were dated to 40,000 years ago. In Borneo, wild cattle were painted at roughly the same time. These are among the oldest figurative artworks on Earth, and yet again, the subjects weren't human. Finally, around 45,000 years ago, modern humans reached Ice Age Europe and filled its caves with images. Chauvet's lions, Altamira's bison, Lascaux's horses, rendered with breathtaking skill, often more lifelike than anything until the Renaissance. But even here, across the most famous art galleries of the Paleolithic, the pattern didn't change. Thousands of animals, dozens of signs, countless handprints, and almost no humans. Which leaves the following puzzle. From Africa to Europe to Asia, from Homo sapiens to Neanderthals, across 60,000 years of symbolic behavior, the one subject consistently missing was the human self. It isn't because they couldn't. The skill is there in every line of ochre and charcoal, which means the absence must be intentional. A silence by choice. If humans and Neanderthals clearly had the skill to paint animals, handprints, and abstract designs, then why are human bodies almost never drawn? Archaeologists have offered explanations, but one by one, they fall apart. The first was simple. They couldn't draw people. The idea is that Paleolithic artists lacked the technical ability to depict the human form, but that collapses the moment you stand in front of Chauvet or Altamira. The lions there are muscular, poised mid-pounce. The bison swell with volume, their hides shaded with delicate color transitions. At Lascaux, entire herds move with cinematic motion. These were not clumsy doodlers. If they could render a lion's mane or a mammoth's eye with such realism, they could have drawn their own kind just as well. The second explanation is taboo. Maybe human figures were forbidden, wrapped in spiritual danger. At first glance, this seems possible, even likely, as some indigenous groups today treat images of the human body with caution. And it's not just tribal ones. Even in our modern societies and up to the Industrial Revolution, there's plenty of tales and myths narrating the link between the soul and the representation of one's image. The best example of this is the picture of Dorian Gray, which was written first in 1890. If you take a sidestep, you could even associate this belief to the more grounded practice of post-mortem photographs, popular in Europe's 19th century and early 20th century. But these photos are usually representing their subjects as sleeping, sometimes in lifelike scenes of family pictures. The practice faded once the embalming process transferred to the funeral parlors, and bodies were exposed directly in their ready-made coffins. Death was unmistakable, no sleep, quite the opposite of the cave walls. In cave art, humans do appear in rare moments, stick-like, masked, hybrid, or dying. If strict taboo was in place, those images shouldn't exist at all. The third explanation is the most popular: shamanism. In this view, cave art records visions seen in trance states. Jean Klotz and David Lewis Williams developed this argument in The Shamans of Prehistory in 1998, showing how sensations of flying, being pierced, or transforming into animals could explain hybrids and wounded men. And for some images it fits, as they do echo patterns found in trance ethnography. But as Lewis Williams himself admitted later in The Mind in the Cave in 2002, shamanism alone can't explain everything. It doesn't account for the violent representations of humans. Never perpetrators, by the way. Always victims. It doesn't explain the bound humans of Addaura. It doesn't explain why, across continents and species, the human figure is not just rare, but consistently associated with death, violence, or distortion. So we're left with a broken pattern. They could draw us, but chose not to. Taboo existed, but was not absolute. Visions explain some figures, but not the whole silence. And that silence is what actually matters. Because when the human body finally does appear on cave walls, it is never neutral. It is speared, broken, masked, or monstrous. Which brings us to the first of those haunting depictions. A figure at Pech-Merle, pierced again and again, lying in the dark beside a cryptic sign. At first, the caves welcome you. Step into Pech-Merle, and the walls are alive with beauty. Horses painted with spotted coats, so precise that a 2011 DNA study confirmed Ice Age horses really did carry that dappled pattern. Hands bloom in ochre, symbols dot the stone. It feels almost celebratory, a record of life. But if you keep walking, deeper into the chamber, the light shifts. Past the horses, the walls change. There, etched in rough black lines, is a human figure. Crude, almost stick-like, and through its torso 5, maybe 10 spears. Next to it, a bold, geometric sign, the aviform, or placard type, repeated across other caves of the region. It has been argued these marks may have carried group identity. If so, then the association of both representations wasn't just a drawing, it was a warning. Deeper still, into the caves of Cougnac, the welcome fades even further. At first you see ibex, deer, elegant megaloceros with antlers like trees. But then the torchlight falls on 2 human figures. One is folded into the outline of a giant deer, its back pierced with spears. The other lies rigid, arms and legs spread, riddled with wounds. Michel Lorblanchet, who studied the cave for decades, wrote that the placement of the projectiles was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Not random violence, but violence staged, then remembered. And then, at Lascaux, the descent becomes absolute. The cave is a cathedral of animals. Over 600 figures of horses, bison, aurochs, and stags. They run across the walls in breathtaking motion, painted with such lifelike skill that nothing matches it until the Renaissance. The cave was such a wonder that it was closed to the public in 1963 to preserve its beautiful depictions. But, despite the detailed animal representations, there is only one human figure. And it's not accessible easily. Hidden in a shaft beneath the main galleries, reachable only by rope or ladder, lies a panel unlike anything else in the cave. A massive bison, its stomach torn open, entrails spilling in vivid red. And in front of it, a man sprawled, stiff and lifeless. His head is bird-like, his arms flung wide, and with an unmistakable sign of arousal. Beside him, a vertical staff topped with a bird. A spear links the man and the bison in what was probably one fatal exchange. For decades, this scene intrigued archaeologists. They have argued, was it a failed hunt or a shaman's vision, a trance where death and transformation blurred? In 2024, a study noted the entrails were drawn with anatomical accuracy, suggesting the artist had watched this very scene play out. Whatever the meaning, it remains the only human-like character in the entire cave, and it's a single figure, buried in darkness, caught in death and ambiguity. By now, the caves no longer feel like galleries of life. A threshold has been passed. At Trois Frères, deep in the Pyrenees, faint engravings reveal a crouching figure with antlers on its head, limbs bent as if dancing. Henri Breuil's sketch made it famous as the sorcerer. At Gabillou, another hybrid, a human body, but this time twisted in pain, bison horns etched on its head. Jean Clotz and David Lewis Williams saw in these figures the traces of trance. Shamans caught mid-transformation, half man, half beast. But they could also be myths in stone, characters from stories long forgotten. And in the Cosquer cave, whose entrance is now drowned beneath the Mediterranean, the journey ends in water. Horses, ibex, and seals fill the walls, but among them lies a single human-like figure, nicknamed the Killed Man. Its body is crude, its head oddly seal-like, pierced and falling. A human shown not in life, but in collapse. Even the last stop, the Addaura engravings in Sicily, follow the same current. Dozens of human figures appear, more than anywhere else in Paleolithic art, but they're not hunting or celebrating. At the center, two lie bound, arms tight against their bodies, surrounded by others who gesture and encircle. Some see ritual, others see sacrifice. Whatever the case, it is not peace, it is performance, and it is human life drawn only at the brink. By the time you climb back into daylight, the pattern is impossible to ignore. The animals are everywhere, alive, powerful, eternal. Nature is taking the central stage. Humans are rare, if not absent from most sites, and when they appear, it is only in extremity, either speared, bound, masked, or falling to their death. The caves don't picture us as hunters or storytellers. They picture us as fragile bodies, victims caught in violence or transformation. And that silence, the refusal to draw the living human self, is louder than anything painted on the walls. To try and understand why, we need to add a bit of context. Step back for a moment. It's tempting to imagine Ice Age Europe as a land teeming with people, clans competing for caves, groups clashing over territory. But step out of the caves and the numbers tell a different story. At the height of the Upper Paleolithic, around 37,000 years ago, the entire population of Europe may have been fewer than 4,000 people. That's less than a modern village spread across an entire continent. The estimate, drawn from work by Chris Stringer and Clive Gamble in Search of the Neanderthals back in 1993, puts population density at about 3 people per 100 square kilometers. By comparison, today's sparsely populated Mongolia has about 2 people per square kilometer, so 200 for the same surface. In groups that small, violence wasn't constant, but when it happened, it was seismic. For decades, the image of prehistory was shaped by the myth of the gentle savage, the idea that foragers lived in timeless harmony with nature and each other, untouched by the corruption of civilization. It's a comforting story that's often used in the media to talk about foragers' African tribes of today's, or in pop culture, such as the Avatar movies. But the evidence doesn't bear it out. Anthropologists Douglas Fry and Patrick Soderbergh set out to test it. In Science in 2013, they analyzed cases of lethal violence across 21 mobile forager societies worldwide. The results cut against both extremes, neither a paradise of peace nor a world of perpetual tribal war. Instead, the pattern was more intimate. About 55% of killings occurred one-on-one, born of quarrels between individuals. About 36% were intra-group, often involving family or close kin. And only 15% were clashes between groups. And even those weren't over land or resources, but over jealousy, insults, or disputes about partners. Other scholars painted a different picture. In War Before Civilization, in 1996, Lawrence Keeley pointed to archaeological trauma. The Kennewick Man with its projectile point lodged into his pelvis bone. The Jahel Sahaba Cemetery, where approximately 40% of individuals show trauma from arrows and spears, interpreted as repeated conflict between groups. In some groups, he suggested, as many as 1 in 4 adult males may have died violently. Yet, in Upper Paleolithic Europe, evidence of such behavior is much rarer, and never on the scale of the massacres found in later farming societies. Anthropologist Raymond Kelly, in Warless Societies and the Origin of War in 2000, drew an important line: the distinction between simple and complex foragers. The so-called simple foragers were small groups, highly mobile, and violence was mostly episodic and interpersonal. It's only with semi-sedentary, complex foragers, which were resource-rich societies, that violence escalated to organized raids. Only then, with sedentism and larger populations, did raids and mass killings become common. Taken together, the evidence shows that violence has always been with us. Not endless armies, that came only later, but quarrels between brothers, cousins, neighbors, common things. And in bands of only 20 or 30 people, those quarrels could be catastrophic. One death might mean a broken hunting party, a family line cut short, a group split in two. That intimacy gave violence a lot more weight than it does today, even in our societies where the value of life has been greatly appraised compared to our more modern past. Back then, it was remembered, retold, and maybe painted. The speared figures of Pech-Merle and Cougnac, the bird-headed man of Lascaux, the bound bodies of Addaura might not be mere idle sketches. They might have been as warnings, lessons, or myths drawn from lived experience as could be for a forager. In societies where oral stories carried memory across generations, painting violence on stone turned one rupture into a permanent reminder. And maybe that's why humans appear only at the edge of collapse. The animals on the walls are eternal, herds that renew each season, the cycle of the hunt repeating. Humans, by contrast, were fragile. One spear, one quarrel, one misstep could tear everything apart. So the caves did not picture us as heroes. They pictured us as fragile bodies in a fragile world, where violence wasn't constant, but when it came, it defined everything. So now, what do we make of it all? The handprints, the speared men, the hybrids, the bound bodies? Why did Paleolithic artists draw thousands of animals in lifelike motion, but reserve humans only for moments of death, distortion, or transformation? The answer isn't that they lacked skill. We've seen the opposite. From Blombos to Borneo to Lascaux, their command of symbol and realism was extraordinary, nor can it be reduced to simple taboo. Humans do appear, but always in extremity. And while shamanic visions surely played a role in some hybrids and trance-like scenes, that doesn't explain the consistent silence across continents and species. The silence itself is the message. For Neanderthals and Homo sapiens alike, animals represented continuity, abundance, power. Herds renewed each season. Predators returned each year. To paint them was to mark the eternal. Humans, by contrast, were fragile. A single killing could fracture a band. A single quarrel could ripple across generations. To paint the human body was to paint rupture, not continuity. That is why, across caves from Spain to Sicily, the human figure appears only when something breaks. Pierced at Pech-Merle and Cougnac, collapsing at Lascaux, half-transformed at Trois Frères and Gabilou, dying at Cosquer, bound at Addaura. Always fragile, always marked by violence, myth, or fear. Archaeologist David Lewis Williams argued in his 2002 The Mind in the Cave that caves were thresholds, liminal spaces where humans confronted the forces that defined them. To draw oneself in that sacred space wasn't to celebrate, but to expose. It meant acknowledging that the human form was not permanent, but precarious. Seen this way, the absence of humans from Paleolithic art wasn't an oversight. It might just be the manifestation of a different worldview. The people who pressed their hands on stone, who shaded bison with charcoal and ochre, saw animals as eternal and themselves as vulnerable. The handprints said, "I was here." The dying figures said, "but only for a moment." And that may be why their art still unsettles us. Because when we finally began to draw ourselves again, tens of thousands of years later, we did the opposite. We filled temples, manuscripts, and museums with human faces. We built statues in our own likeness, portraits of kings, saints, and soldiers to celebrate the glory of these characters. In the modern world, we've gone further still. Billions of images of ourselves, carried in pockets, broadcast on screens. We developed technologies all the way to being able to capture not only a snap in time, but entire moments, events, and when pieced together, whole periods of modern history. If Paleolithic caves erase the human image, our age is drowning in it, glorifying it till it loses the meaning it once had. We take so many that most of them are absolutely worthless, despite the sheer technological prowess of embedding a moment on a piece of paper. And now, we've crossed into a stranger phase. Images no longer need us at all. Generative AI can summon portraits, landscapes, and videos of people who never lived, events that never happened, faces that belong to no one. In a way, we've created the opposite of Paleolithic silence, a flood of humanity without any humans in it. Pictures detached from memory, from witness, from experience. If the cave showed too little of us, our age may be showing too much, until the image itself becomes empty. Only now, 30,000 years later, surrounded by cities, screens, and worlds that don't even exist, we recognize the truth they painted. Time passes, animals endure, seasons return, but humans are nothing but fragile. It began with a handprint, pressed against stone, dusted with ochre, a quiet mark that said, "I was here." But when Paleolithic people dared to picture themselves, they didn't draw life. They drew wounds, hybrids, and bodies collapsing into death. No hunters, no heroes, no families, just figures at the edge of disappearance. For them, animals were eternal. Horses thundered back each season. Bison returned with the cold. Lions prowled the dark. To paint animals was to paint continuity. To paint humans was to paint rupture. That's why, across caves from Pech-Merle to Addaura, our image appears only when something has broken. Or so we think. After all, these are art pieces we can only interpret with our modern lenses now. But since then, we've filled the silence with endless reflections of ourselves. First portraits, then statues, all the way to selfies and videos. And now, synthetic faces spun from the blur of AI code. But the caves still whisper a different truth, one that comes from the depth of our existence, and that holds true still to this day. Our image is not eternal. That fragility was the truest picture we ever left behind. If this story changed how you see cave art, the way we represented ourselves and our whole worldview during prehistoric times, consider liking this video. And let us know, which figure haunted you most in the comments? Share this with someone who still thinks the caves are only about beauty. And subscribe for more echoes from the deep past. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.